Well, good morning, Park. How you all doing out there today? Get a hand clap just to see if you're awake. All right. If somebody next to you wasn't clapping, just give them a little elbow. Say, man, you can't do that. You got to clap when the preacher say that. That's okay. You don't have to clap. Hopefully you'll be waking up in just a little bit. My name is Nathan Payne. The privilege I have is to serve here as a pastor here at this location of Park Community Church. And man, looking out and seeing each of your faces, getting to hear you sing and declare the person who Jesus is and what he has done, that's a joy. So grateful to have you with us. Also, just want to welcome those of you all who are watching us online, and grateful that you are joining us and looking forward to when you'll be with us in person. We'll be in the book of Romans on chapter 6. We'll be on page 943 in your blue Bibles. If you need to grab one out of the seat pocket in front of you or below you, or go ahead and turn there in your device. Today is Super Bowl Sunday. And 12 of you are excited. It's estimated that about 100 million people or so are going to watch the game. I hope to be among that number as we will watch 22 players on the field battle it out to claim the title of champion. All their labor, all their toil, all their effort, all their energy, the plays, the practices, the coaching is leading up to this defining moment. And at the end of that game, someone will receive the Lombardi Trophy as champions of the world. And I can't help but think, what will they earn in that moment that's going to last forever? I look around in this room, and this is not my message, so don't start the clock. I see a bunch of men. When I look out and I see each of your faces, men, I know that many of us, most of us want to win at the things that actually matter most. But if we're honest, we often don't know how to make that happen, and on top of that, we don't have other men in our lives that are pushing us along on that journey. Well, I want to tell you all that authentic manhood will change that. It's a gathering of men that we start on this Wednesday at 6:30 right in our second floor in the cafe, and there's so much at stake for you not to be a part of this. I was asking one of the sisters at Park who's married to a brother at Park who has been part of this, and she said this about how it's changed his life. One example is how he came up with a mission statement created a few months ago to outline his hopes and goals for his leadership in our home, and some other things that happened in his life that I saw. The fruit was that he was more consistent in God's word. He was more authentic in his relationships and building relationships with other godly men and having a Christ-centered lens for his home and for his work. That's what happened in that space. And man, I just want to invite you to be a part of that. If you don't have other guys you're running with, I'll be there. And I got a bunch of guys that have been running with me. A couple of these guys sitting at the front row who'll be with us on that journey. We want to be men who win at the things that matter most, that will last for eternity. Well, I couldn't also help but think about today and how today is a gift. So we think about what's transpired in the last week in the life of our world in which we live, that there's some people who were here with us a week ago who are no longer here with us today. My challenge is for us that in these moments as we open up God's word, that we would not take for granted, that we would genuinely have hearts to receive what God has for us today. So before we jump in, let me just pray for us. God, we thank you for this day. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the gift of being able to sit under your teaching, recognizing that it is you who loves us, who is pursuing us and wants to transform us. God, would you transform us, anoint the words that come from my mouth, that they would transform the lives of your people. Why don't you take a moment and just say this prayer to God? You don't have to say it out loud. God, will you speak to me today that I might be changed? In Jesus' name, amen. In 1853, a memoir was written by a man named Solomon Northup. Its title was 12 Years a Slave, and it chronicled Solomon's harrowing journey through one of the most horrific experiences that any of us could imagine going through. Solomon, an African-American man who was born free and living free in New York, found himself in 1841 heading to Washington, D.C., and there he was drugged and kidnapped and sold into slavery. He was transported to the state of Louisiana, where he was to work on different plantations for the next 12 years before he could get released. The story was chronicled in the 2013 film by the same name, and in that film, which is so hard to watch, it paints the brutality and terror of his experience. Watching him get torn away from his wife, Anne, and their 3 kids, Elizabeth and Margaret and Alonzo, wondering if he would ever be able to hold them and see them again. He witnesses and experiences unthinkable horrors as he watches fellow human beings get tortured, whipped, and abused. At every effort to escape, he's thwarted. He wonders if he's going to die on that plantation. You know, when you open up that book and read it, or when you watch the movie, there's something in your mind that you can't help but think is that, wait a second, this can't be happening. This is a free man. This man should be free. How could this be happening? What would you do if you were made a slave? As we jump into Romans chapter 6 this morning, talk about what the Apostle Paul is painting for us. I've titled this message, Slaves Who Are Free. Slaves who are free. Now, it's important to remember that up to this point in the book of Romans, that Paul has been making this argument that our standing before God is based on the righteousness of Christ, that at the moment we trust in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and his death and his resurrection, putting our hope in his resurrection, we are what's called justified. Justified, meaning our standing before God that's sealed and secured because of what Christ has done. And Steve and Jackson have laid out the incredible benefits of this reality of justification, our standing before God. And last week, Jackson opened up Romans chapter 6 in the first part of this passage as Paul is beginning to turn the emphasis onto what we call sanctification. Justification is the foundation, but sanctification is what God is doing to transform us and make us more like Jesus. It's important for us to remember a couple things, that justification is something that takes place immediately. It's immediate, but sanctification is a process. Justification is immediate. Sanctification is a process. I like to use this analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but maybe it'll help you to understand it a little bit. You know, about 14 years ago, there was a little baby boy that was born into our family. His name is Gabriel. Everybody say, ooh. Everybody say, ah. This little boy, 14 years ago, is born into our family. And here's the thing, as a baby, there was nothing he could do to be more or less my son than simply being born. It wasn't about what he did. He was simply my son. Justification. Can't change. But at the same time, this same little baby boy who's my son would inevitably continue to grow physically and mentally, emotionally, and learn habits and get his personality would come forth. And what would happen is that people would say, oh, you look like your dad. Now, somebody are like, man, yeah, he's a little bit more caramel than I am. Now, y'all know, if you know my wife, she's peach skin. And so when you get chocolate and peach, you get caramel. But if you were to spend time with Gabriel and kind of hang out with him, you'll see that he has habits and sort of things about him that reflect his dad that he has grown into. That's sanctification, where you have justified, you are one of the children of your parent, but sanctification, you start to look more and more like your father. Sanctification is a process. You need to understand that when Paul makes this claim about justification, that we are justified because of what Christ has done through the grace of God, it was something that was completely radical and it didn't make sense. And it was such a thing that didn't make sense that folks were asking questions that Paul anticipated. And one of those was simply this: hey, can't we be free to do as we wish if we're no longer under God's law and we're under grace? Because that's where justification comes from. Look at verse 15. What then, are we to sin because we are not under law but under grace? Paul says, by no means. He's going to explain this argument and open it up as he begins to make a statement that may shock all of us. And it's this, as we're going to open up in this passage. He says that we are all slaves to something. He's going to explain it as we go further, but folks, in this room on this Super Bowl Sunday, February 2nd, 2020, every single one of us in this room is a slave to something. Look at verse 16. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? Notice that what Paul says, that you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin or of obedience, which is righteousness. He's making the case that it's an either or. Now, it's important for us to understand, to back up, that when Paul is referencing this term slave, it's the Greek word doulos. And the Roman institution of being a slave, or a doulos, was quite different than the institution of slavery that took place in North America during the 17th through 19th centuries. See, in Paul's day, there were a number of people who were slaves because they sold themselves into slavery. It was a means for them to make a living. They were bound to their master to be loyal to them for a period of time, but they could still own property. They could get married, and they could even achieve social advancement. And here, get this, they could also work for their wages so that they could buy their freedom. That was slavery in the first century that Paul is referencing. Now, I want to be really clear, just so it's not a question in your mind, that the New Testament, God's word, assumes that kidnapping and selling and trafficking human beings is a grievous sin against God. And you can find that in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and Revelation chapter 18. We don't have time to unpack that, but just so it's clear. But we're focusing on Paul's reference to this first century Roman context of being a slave. He's making the case that we are all slaves to something. Now, if there's something in you that resists that, I could say that it's probably because we live in a culture where our highest values are things like autonomy and individuality. We don't like people to tell us what to do. We want to be free to do as we please. I mean, just a quick poll, raising your hand. How many of us in this room right now, maybe you're watching at home online, like people to tell you what to do? Just raise your hand really high. I think I counted one hand. I was at another location preaching, and a kid raised his hand and said, I like people to tell me what to do. I was like, man, you lying in church. Don't do that. I'm going to ask your mama right afterwards. None of us raised our hand. There's something in us that's like, I don't want anyone or anything in control of me. And yet Paul is saying that there are two options, that we are indeed either slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness or slaves to God. Look what Jesus said, Matthew Chapter 6, no one can serve two masters. Maybe you've heard this. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. Notice the word serve that's underlined. That word serve is the active word of the word slave, of doulos, that Paul's referencing here in this passage in Romans. And Jesus is pointing to the fact that you have to choose, that we all have a master. It's just a matter of who or what. In her book, Out of the Salt Shaker, Rebecca Manley Pippert says this. She says this: whatever controls us is our Lord. Those who seek power is controlled by power. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. The person who seeks acceptance is controlled by acceptance. We do not control ourselves. We are controlled by the Lord of our lives. So the question that every single one of us needs to ask this morning is this: who or what is our master? Sin or righteousness? And what happens if sin is our master, if we're slaves to sin, and what does it bring? Look at verse 19, part of 19. You once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness. That's another word for sin, leading to more lawlessness. Another word for sin. Look at verse 21. But what fruit were you getting at that time from the things of which you are now, notice, ashamed? For the end of those things is death. Sin will always lead to more sin, to more shame, and ultimately to death. Now, how does a slavery to sin produce even more sin? The simple fact is that as we pursue our own interests, our own desires, our own longings that are outside of God's will, that we intensify those desires, we repeat those desires. Jesus in John chapter 8 says, truly, truly I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. And it literally shows up in our very biology, in our brains, in our neural pathways that are formed from the habits that we attend to, the attitudes, the reactions, the pursuits and responses in our own hearts and minds that drive us to do what we do, sometimes without even thinking about it. Slavery to sin brings more sin, but it doesn't just bring more sin. It also brings shame. I mean, if we could play a movie of every thought, desire, and motivation that has played out in your heart and mind through this whole week and play it right on the screen, how many of us would just be embarrassed by that? Most of us would be. Why would we be embarrassed? Because on the other side of embarrassment is this idea of shame, that we would be afraid of being exposed. And the reality of shame, it's a reality that shows up at the very first time sin enters into the world, where Adam and Eve, who they sin against God, and the first thing they do is they cover themselves up. And it shows up in our lives and the things that we try to cover up. Maybe we try to cloak ourselves in our reputation. We try to cloak ourselves in our social media profile, and we're sending all the nice photos up on Instagram, but inside we're falling apart. We try to cloak ourselves with posturing and our position, and the reality is that inside fundamentally is an issue of shame. And the Bible makes it very clear that a direct result of our slavery to sin will be shame. Sin doesn't just bring shame, it also produces death. Notice that Paul repeats this several times. It's a way of us being reminded that this is really important for us to hear. Look at verse 16, verse 21, verse 23. Sin, which leads to death. The end of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. Taking us all the way back to the garden in the very beginning of time, when God said to Adam in the garden, he said, look, don't eat the fruit, for the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Sin brings death. Rings true for us individually, Rings true for us as we experience separation from God. And the first section of our whole Roman series was titled The Vast Separation, as pointing out our sinfulness and our gap between us and a completely righteous and holy God. A gap that we can't cross, that he had to cross to us. It's not just this idea of death and separation from God, but also separation from one another, a deterioration of relationships. I mean, I look out and I see there's some moms and dads, some brothers and sisters. I see some friends. I see some folks who maybe you're in the same small group. And if you were to kind of talk about some of how your relationships have gone and some of the distance and separation you've experienced and deterioration of relationships, I can tell you fundamentally at the heart of all those is a issue of sin. It breaks up, pulls apart, destroys. Sin brings death to us individually. But sin doesn't just affect us individually. It also rings true and brings death systemically. It infects the very systems of power and authority that are at play in our city and across the world. I'll just give you one small example. The reality of modern day slavery and trafficking that's happening in our world right now in 2020. According to the International Justice Mission, did you know there's over 40 million people enslaved today globally? That's more than ever in human history. I say that again, more people are enslaved today, right now, than have ever been in human history. It's generating $150 billion of revenue annually. And 1 in 4 of those victims of modern slavery in the world in which we live today, infected by a slavery to sin, is that 1 in 4 of those victims is a child. All of that coming from a motivation of greed, control, and self-interest. This slavery to sin doesn't just affect our own personal lives, it infects the very systems in which we operate and live in. Sin will produce death and destruction, ultimately leading to our very separation from God. And that's the worst kind of death there is because it's eternal. To fully yield to the slavery to sin and to say, I will just remain independent of him. I will be separated from him. That's the horror of its end, is spiritual death, to be completely separated from God for eternity. Slavery to sin produces more sin. It produces shame and it produces death. But there's another kind of slavery that produces freedom. Look at verse 17 and 18. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. Set free from sin, having become slaves of righteousness. There's a freedom that's a consequence of being a slave to righteousness or a slave to God. There's a freedom that we experience. Freedom from pursuing the idols of significance and trying to please others and find our identity in what others say of us and think of us. Freedom from having to pursue pleasure and comfort and trying to drink, snort, and smoke our ways into peace. Freedom from control. Freedom from the idol of seeking to always be in control and feeling that we have to be in control in order for us to be safe, accepted, or loved. Freedom from shame. As an obedient slave to God in his righteousness, we can confront the shame about the things that we have done in our past. As a matter of fact, some of those very things of which we were ashamed, God will redeem for his purposes, to be a platform upon which he can show his grace. When I think about that reality, and as I was thinking about this message, I was wrestling with sharing some of my story because, I'm here, I'm a pastor, I'm standing before you, and I genuinely wrestled with, do I tell them, do I express to them the things that I've wrestled with and the things that have been part of my slavery to sin over the years? being exposed as a little boy to pornography and watching its tentacles grip my soul. The destruction it caused, the pain it caused, and my relationships and my relationship with God to other people. The utter shame that I felt. And in a room like this morning, I know that there's men and women, that's where you are today. With that very same issue. Or maybe it's another thing. And yet, the very thing that I was ashamed of, for so long, God in his grace redeemed and restored and set me free. And so now as a pastor, I sit across the table and I say, look, I can tell you that there's freedom. I can tell you that God can rescue you. I can tell you that he can heal you. I can tell you that he can use you. Because that's what he does. So I don't know what your thing is that you're wrestling with today. But I can tell you that he brings freedom. I can stand here without shame as a child of God who's been rescued, who's been loved, who's been freed, to proclaim it to you. Slave to righteousness. I want to be clear that being a slave to righteousness does not mean that you will be sinless. And it doesn't mean that we all of a sudden just try to make our life all about avoiding sin. Righteousness is much more than that. Being a slave to righteousness, a slave to God, is much more than that. It's a pursuit of being transformed into the character and likeness of Jesus. It's not slavery to religion. It's participating in the expression of the character and the will of God in every sphere of our life and existence. You know, some of you are saying, yeah, Pastor Nate, that sounds great, but I'm in the middle of it. I'm wrestling with it right now. I'm bound by a sin pattern in my life that I just can't stop. I can't stop this hold of alcohol on my life. I can't stop this hold of seeking serial dates and relationships to find purpose and meaning and acceptance. I can't stop. What am I to do? I'm a follower of Jesus, but I can't seem to break free. Let's look what Paul says here. He uses the word that repeats a number of times. He says, present. He repeats it, reminds us that it's important. Look at verse 16. If you present yourselves to anyone, in verse 19, the first part, you once presented your members. In verse 19, again at the end, so now present your members. Present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification and transformation, if you will. Present, it means to offer yourself. It's an imperative in this verse. It's a command. It means that Paul is saying, do this. Be proactive in living out the righteousness that's been given to you. Notice that he says your members. That's another way to say it's your actual body. It means it's actually you, all of you, the whole you, the real you. The very instruments that maybe you used in the past for yielding to sin and being a slave to sin. That same thought pattern, the same brain that you used to contemplate things that were displeasing to God. The same eyes that you used to look at things that dishonored him. Now you see with those same eyes the way that he sees. The feet that took you places that you shouldn't have gone are the same feet that will take you to the places that he wants you to. Present. Offer yourself. Paul's going to come back to this and get very practical in a couple chapters later as we'll continue in our series a few weeks from now. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1, he says this, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Notice what he says in verse 22, but now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves of God, the fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end, eternal life. The fruit of our slavery and obedience to God is sanctification, this process where he is transforming us. instead of leading to our destruction and deterioration of relationships and deterioration of the things that matter most, we are transformed to become more like Jesus, where we experience the fruit of his Spirit in us, where there's more love, more joy, more peace, more gentleness, more kindness, more self-control, all those things generated as we submit and yield to being slaves to righteousness. So how do we do it? Do we just grit our teeth and white knuckle it and do our best? I can't even say white knuckle. I ain't got white knuckles. Is it brown knuckling? I don't know. I have to research that. Do we just try harder? Do we just give up because it's just too hard? Maybe that's what you feel like this morning. We're supposed to be free, but it just doesn't feel like I'm free. This is where it's so important for us to be reminded this morning that it is in the gospel where we find freedom to be slaves to God, to righteousness. Look at verse 17. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. And having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. Paul's reminding them that their freedom from sin came as a direct result of the gospel transforming their hearts. Look at that word heart, from the heart. And then it's the standard of teaching. It's talking about the gospel, work that God did in them and for them and continues to do, that gives them the ability to be slaves to God and of his righteousness. I love how Paul uses this analogy of slavery in the first century in Rome when he says this. Because here's the thing, in that time, like I said, a slave in that period of time, they could work and save wages, their wages that they were paid, and they could build that up. If they had enough, then they could purchase their freedom. So it was by their own toil, it was by their own sweat, by their own labor, by their own effort that they would secure their freedom. The gospel flips that completely upside down. See, verse 23 says the wages of sin is death. As slaves to sin, the wages that we earn are death and destruction, and all of our efforts only lead to shame and deterioration, and it's quite impossible for us to work our way to secure our freedom. And this is where the gospel is such good news. You see that instead of like the slaves who had to work to earn their freedom, instead of that, it's the great and kind master who gives up his freedom so that we can have freedom. He gives up his life so we can have life. Look at verse 6 in Romans chapter 5. It says, for while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the religious. Christ died for those who pulled up their bootstraps and got their act together. Christ died for those who, by their own strength of their own hand and trying their very best, became good people. No, it says Christ died for who? The ungodly. He didn't just die for us. He rose again and secured victory over sin, victory over shame, and victory over death itself. And it's through him that we are set free, that our freedom from the slave master of sin is something that is not something we earned. It's something that is given to us. It's earned by what Christ has done. Look at Romans 6:23 on that second half of that verse. It says, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. There's an element when we think about this that we all kind of slide into, that you get what you deserve, that if you work hard, you'll get paid back for it, or karma, or the universe is just paying you back for what you did. And yet, in this context, you think about the Apostle Paul. This was the man who had sent people to their deaths because he hated them. This is the man who put people in prison, men, women, and children. This is the man who was so self-righteous that he was willing to go as far far and as hard as he could to persecute those who were followers of Jesus. And as he's writing this, I can't help but thinking as he's thinking to himself, yes, I used to be a slave to sin, caught in my own self-righteousness, and yet in his grace, God rescued me and now has allowed me to be a slave to him. All because of the gospel. We, as followers of Jesus, we have our freedom secured by the free gift of another, by the work of another, by the wages of another, Jesus himself. We have that privilege to bear his name and call him Master. Solomon Northup was a free man who was made a slave. It took 12 years before he was able to get released from slavery to freedom. And this morning, I'm here to remind you that your freedom was not secured in 12 years. It was secured in 3 days. It was secured when Jesus died on that cross and bore all the weight of our sinfulness and our rebellion and rose again 3 days later to give you the promise of security of freedom in him. And I implore you today that if you've not yet received that gift, let today be that gift. Let today be the day you receive that gift, where you transfer from being a slave to sin to becoming a slave of righteousness. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're here this morning and I don't know what you're in the middle of, what battle you're facing, what challenge you are wrestling with, I'm here to remind you that because of what Christ has done, because of the freedom that was secured through his death on the cross, that you have a new master. And so the work of sanctification is now continuing and will continue and will be completed in your life, that your freedom is found in being a slave to the great and good master, Jesus. We are slaves who are free. Slaves who are free. Let that be true of us. Let us be reminded that it was secured through the cross of Christ. Let's live and walk in that reality. We're slaves who are free. Let's pray. God, your grace is real. Your grace is at work. Just by the fact that we are here sitting under the sound of your word, it reminds us, oh God, that you have pursued us, that you continue to pursue us. God, would you break through into our lives and our hearts and the deepest parts of our shame and our guilt and our sinfulness. Shine the light of the gospel there and set us free that we might be slaves as unto you. That we might experience more life, more hope, more joy, more peace, and send and share that to everyone in the world in which you've sent us. Got to pray for that person who's right here, right now, wrestling. Will they trust in you and receive the gift of salvation for the first time? Would you prevail upon them even now in these moments? And we promise to give you the glory because you alone are worthy of it, Jesus. Sing in your name we pray. Amen.